Okay, now we are back. At this point, you have looked at some of the factors, elements, features of that are involved in the design of a service setting, and some of the factors that influence what people might experience in a service setting: music, colors, sounds, how employees are costumed. You've looked at the core product that provides the need satisfying ability, in addition to supplementary products that may augment or allow us to customize and differentiate a product offering. And then you designed a service script where we looked from the customer perspective, all of the steps that a customer has to engage in order to prepare for consumption of and to actually consume a service offering. And we did that using the example of air travel, right? So now we're going to continue with the example of air travel, and we're going to look at some of the other considerations in designing a service setting from the customer perspective. Your text talks about the idea that how we design a service setting can create an experience where customers want to spend time there. They really feel comfortable. If you think of one of your, maybe a favorite coffee shop, where they have comfortable chairs that you can just sink in, and there's music playing in the background that you're enjoying, free Wi-Fi, beverages or food that you enjoy, and where the sights, the smells, and the sounds are very pleasant and conducive to creating a comfortable workspace. That's a place that you probably want to spend some time in. But there are other environments that might lead to avoidance, where you find it really a little undesirable and you don't want to stay long. Now that could be a function of, poor design of the service setting, or it might be by design in a setting where they need people to move through that setting fairly quickly, right? But in that case, we have an environment where we don't want people to get comfortable and stay a while, right? So when we think about that, and right now I'm looking just from the customer perspective, but thinking about creating an environment where people want to spend time and enjoy spending time, your text talks about or identifies 4 factors that we can consider in designing a service setting. And those factors include the duration of the service setting as an operational tool, the service setting as a service identifier, and the 4th is the service setting as an orientation tool. Now, the service setting, this idea of the duration of the service setting is particularly apropos in the example that we're using with the challenges that people faced during their air travels, trying to get to and fro during the holidays. When we talk about this idea of duration of service setting, the idea is the longer that someone stays in an environment, there are things that we notice. And these things might make it a more pleasant experience, or certainly could make it a more unpleasant experience, right? The longer you sit someplace and have time to look around and observe, you might hear sounds that you now find annoying. The constant drip drip of a faucet in the background. Or as I'm hearing now, people are scraping their cars. I can actually hear that. They're scraping the ice off their cars. That's not going to be an irritant because it's not going to be a sound that persists. Were that to go on for about an hour, it probably would be. If there are smells that a short period of time aren't bothersome, they might become more troubling the longer you sit, okay? So the longer someone sits in a space, there are more things that they notice that they might find pleasant or annoying. We also, your text talks about this idea of the service setting as an operational tool. And it talks about if the setting is properly designed, it can not only lower your operational costs, but can help expedite the process or make it easier to deliver the service, right? So being more efficient, whether it's how you have your workflow, the type of equipment that you're using, but creating an environment where it's easier to provide the service. And the next bullet is the service setting as a service identifier. If you think back to the example we talked about in class, we talked about when I was on the bus one day going north and went past the Aston Martin showroom. And while I wasn't familiar with that type of vehicle, I knew immediately by looking at the showroom that it was a luxury, high-performance sports car, right? And I had mentioned to you that across the street, there was a Honda and a BMW dealership. And while both obviously also good cars, their showrooms look very different. And one in particular, the Honda had sale signs up, Aston Martin did not. But we can tell from the service setting that we're able to communicate what differentiates our product and also to convey something about the value and quality of that product, right? Or product and or service. And then finally, the service setting is an orientation tool. If you'll think back to the field exercise that we did just before the holiday break, do you remember we went across the street and visited some of the restaurants? And one of the things that I wanted you to look at is how each of the restaurants had a slightly different layout. But their layout and design helped communicate to customers what that service process was, right? Do you remember one of the restaurants where the hostess would seat you? They had signage that told you, please wait to be seated. Others had the rail and the roping that directed customer and traffic flow through areas where you selected the pizza or pasta, the food that you would that was already prepared, but that you could see and select. Another one of the establishments actually has the food preparation line, the backstage, right in clear view, right? So you get to select the ingredients as they prepared your sandwich or your salad. So when we think about service oriented or service setting as an orientation tool, it helps people understand what the service process is, right? So what are one of the things I want you to do for this next segment is let's take a look at those 4 elements. I'm going to call these bullets here. The appeal of the service setting, duration, service setting as an operational tool, service setting as a service identifier, and service setting as an orientation tool. I want you to look at 2 of those 4 bullets and discuss ways in which you might create an approach or avoidance environment for customers, okay, and explain your decision. Now, I actually would like you to continue using the airline example. So, and actually you can do it looking at ways in which you might create approach or avoidance. But please explain the rationale for your decision. And then keep in mind that we could also do the same thing. We're not going to do it in this particular exercise, but we could do the same thing for employees. As you remember, if your text talked about one of the things about the service setting is we can design a service setting that feels kind of like a home away from home, since employees spend so much time in that service environment that there are things that we can do to make that a comfortable environment for them also, right? But right in this particular exercise, I want you to focus on the customer, and I want you to use the example, continue using the example of the airline and what we can do to create an approach or avoidance environment for customers who are planning air travel, okay? So, and after you do that exercise, we'll give this a minute. I'll give you a minute to take a look at those bullets and think about what you might do with that, okay? And if you'd like, you can pause the video and then come back. Great, so hopefully you took a minute to pause. And now you're back after having thought about 2 of the 4 ways in which you can create approach or avoidance for the customer in this air travel situation. Now what I'd like you to do is create a service blueprint. Remember we said that the blueprint is, or your text describes a blueprint, as a graphic representation of the service performance. So the service blueprint is a tool that's used for designing the entire process of a service. And where it differs from the service script, if you think about what you did with the service script, you simply defined all of the steps that were involved from the customer perspective in engaging in and preparing for and actually consuming the service or product offering, right? Now in the case of the blueprint, if you'll notice here, we're actually trying to outline every step of the process, but also look at, how much time does it take? How does the customer move through this process? And we're also looking at, from the business's perspective, we want to understand what activities must take place, not only front stage, that part that's visible to the customer, but also backstage, right? And so if you'll notice in figure 4.4, they give an example of a service blueprint. It's a visit to a local pub. The top shows what happens when the customer walks in, right? They enter the pub, they choose a seat, and they take you through each of those steps. And they also have estimated times. Well, you may or may not, in this particular example, have times, and I'm less concerned about that. But what I do want you to think about, look at the item under acceptable execution time. Look at the item called fail point. What they're talking about here is where are there potential areas where we might fail to deliver in our service performance. So I want in your design of your blueprint, I would like you to identify potential fail points that might occur, and particularly if you traveled where they did occur. And I also am interested in your identification of the participants in that particular phase of the blueprint, right? So in some cases, there might be some steps in the design of the process that involve only the customer or passenger. There may be other cases where the steps will involve customers or airline passengers interacting and engaging with one another. Other steps that might involve customer or airline passenger engaging with an employee. So I want you to think about each of those as you're developing your blueprint. You'll also note at the bottom of the diagram where we have backstage, and they're showing physical evidence. Make note of what some of the backstage functions might be also, and the key activities involved there. Because you remember when we talked earlier about service as theater, we talked about, well, oftentimes the backstage is that part that is not visible to the customer. It can be key and very significant in having an impact on the customer experience. Right? Remember we talked about the cleanliness, for example, of a bathroom, that the people who are handling cleaning bathrooms in a restaurant or any public space actually play a really key role. We may not see them doing that, but we see the result of their work. And particularly in a restaurant, a clean or dirty bathroom conveys information to us about the image and the type of service that we might expect, right? So let's have you design your blueprint. And what I want you to do is, like I said, let's continue with the example of the airline. And imagine that you work for that airline. So I want you to design a blueprint for that service. And keep in mind that we want to consider both the front stage and the backstage element. Okay? And just as the example I gave for the bathroom, we want to think about how each element of the physical environment, big or small, can have an impact on the customer's experience of that service. And as I indicated earlier, for each of the stages of the blueprint, I want you to indicate who the participants are, because in some cases it might simply be the customer, or in this case, airline passenger, by him or herself. Or it might involve, at that particular stage of the blueprint, some interaction among fellow passengers, or it might involve interaction between a customer and the employee of the airline, okay? So I'd like you to make note of the participants at each stage. Then I also would like you, when you're looking at the blueprint, after you put it together, identify potential problem areas. And notice on the diagram from your text, they call them fail points. But what I want you to look at is, where do you see potential problem areas arising, given your sketch of this blueprint? And then the next step I want you to do is to brainstorm ways in which you might fix the fail points that you've identified. And those fail points, again, are problem areas or potential problem areas that you see that may arise. So again, that's one of the reasons why we can use something like a service blueprint, right? It can help us see where our process is working, identify ways to improve our process, even if we don't have problems, and identify, perhaps more importantly, ways to fix problems that we already know exist, okay? So let's go through that exercise, and then we'll come back for one short closing video. Thanks.